Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the Diplomacy and Discourse podcast. I'm your host, AR, and I'm thrilled to have you with me for part 1 of today's thought-provoking episode. This is the first of a 2, maybe 3-part series where we'll be unpacking some of the most influential ideas in international relations. Today, we begin with Samuel P. Huntington's famous and highly debated Clash of Civilizations theory, and how its arguments continue to echo in today's global geopolitics. Your support means the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts with us at diplomacyandiscourse@gmail.com. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's dive into this fascinating exploration of power, culture, and politics. But before we get started, a quick disclaimer. This might be a topic of contention for some of you listeners. I'm not here to state that I agree or disagree with Huntington. Nonetheless, I think it remains an important framework that has shaped policy debates, so it's vital we understand both its insights and its criticisms. So picture this, a world in transition, where the old ideological battles of the Cold War have faded, but new lines of division threaten to emerge, drawn not around politics or economics, but around culture and religion. That's the world Huntington asks us to imagine. First formulated in a 1993 article and expanded into his 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, Huntington's thesis argues that in the post-Cold War era, cultural and religious identities will become the primary drivers of conflict. In essence, he divides the globe into major civilizational blocs: Western, Islamic, Chinese, Hindu, Orthodox, Latin American, African, and others, and claims that fault lines between these blocs will become the flashpoints of global politics. Why is this theory then so controversial? Many scholars argue that it oversimplifies the complexities of identity, reducing billions of people to broad cultural categories. Others worry that it can encourage stereotypes, feed prejudice, and even justify confrontational policies. And yet, the theory refuses to fade away. Every time tensions escalate between the West and the Islamic world, whether after 9/11, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or even recent debates about migration and cultural integration in Europe, commentators bring Huntington back into the conversation. Similarly, the growing rivalry between the United States and China is often cited as a civilizational clash, with democratic liberalism on one side and a Confucian authoritarian model on the other. And when Russia frames its war in Ukraine as a defense of Orthodox Slavic identity against Western encroachment, echoes of Huntington's thesis also emerge. These examples show how Huntington's arguments, even if imperfect, continue to shape the way leaders, scholars, and the media interpret global conflicts. As I revisited Huntington's work, several questions came to mind. Could this really be the roadmap to our future? What happens if cultural and religious identities replace ideology as the dominant source of conflict? How would this reshape diplomacy, alliances, and even the way ordinary people interact across borders? So with those questions in mind, let's bring Huntington's theory into today's global landscape and examine whether his predictions hold up in the 21st century. Huntington argued that the widespread Western belief in the universality of values, democracy, liberalism, and human rights is misplaced in today's global landscape. We live in a shifting world where economic, military, and political power is more diffused than at any point in modern history. The West no longer enjoys unchallenged dominance. The rise of new economic giants in the East, the resurgence of old powers like Russia and China, and the restructuring of the global economy have created both uncertainty and new areas of competition. On today's geopolitical chessboard, Huntington highlighted two civilizations as especially significant: China and Islam. For China, as one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, China has steadily reasserted itself, aiming to reclaim regional leadership and challenge Western interests. Its rapid economic growth, military modernization, and ambitious projects like the Belt and Road Initiative shows Beijing's determination to expand its influence. Washington, meanwhile, responds with Indo-Pacific alliances, trade restrictions, and explicit support for Taiwan's autonomy. From trade wars to military drills in the South China Sea, the clash of strategic visions between the US and China seems to echo Huntington's predictions. And for the Islamic civilization, Huntington controversially wrote that Islam has bloody borders, pointing to recurring conflicts along Muslim, non-Muslim frontiers. Events like the Iranian Revolution, the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Syrian Civil War, the rise of ISIS, and the ongoing Gaza war all seem to reinforce parts of his arguments. Yet, here too, we must question, are these conflicts primarily civilizational, or are they just as much about state power, authoritarian rule, colonial legacies, and global inequality? And many scholars pushed back. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Peace Prize winning economist, warns against reducing people to one dimension of identity, like religion or civilization. In his Identity and Violence 2006 work, Sen argues that humans hold many overlapping identities, like national, professional, linguistic, regional, cultural, and that conflict arises when people are boxed into a single civilizational label. Edward Said, author of Orientalism, critiqued Huntington directly, calling the clash of civilizations a dangerous simplification that fosters an us versus them mindset. Said argued that Huntington's framing was less about describing the world and more about justifying Western fears after the Cold War. And there's Francis Fukuyama, writing just before Huntington, envisioned a very different outcome. In The End of History and The Last Man, 1992, he claimed liberal democracy would be the final form of global political organization. Instead of endless clashes, Fukuyama imagined the spread of Western values as nearly inevitable, an argument disrupted by the very events Huntington would later interpret as civilizational conflict. Adding to this, globalization complicates Huntington's vision. Despite conflicts, the 21st century has also seen unprecedented interconnectedness. Muslim-majority countries are deeply tied to global economies. The Gulf states acting as financial hubs, Turkey straddling East and West, Indonesia emerging as a G20 leader. China's factories are deeply intertwined with US consumers. Technology, trade, and migration mean that civilizations are not sealed compartments, but overlapping networks. So the deeper question is this: are we truly witnessing a clash of civilizations? Or do Huntington's predictions merely provide a convenient story to explain what are really power struggles, resource competitions, and identity politics layered on top of globalization? So, for example, US-China relations are both rivalry and partnership. Islam and the West clash in some contexts, but Muslims are also integral participants in Western societies. And there's global challenges like climate change, AI governance, pandemics, which all demand collective solutions, not isolation. Huntington saw inevitable clashes. His critiques suggest a more nuanced reality, one where identities overlap, where cooperation and conflict coexist, and where politics, rather than civilizations alone, drive much of the story. So let's take Denmark for example. It's a nation known for its openness and multicultural values that found itself at the center of global controversy in 2005. The publication of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad in a Danish newspaper ignited outrage across the Muslim world, triggering protests, embassy attacks, and even violent clashes. What seemed to the Danes as an exercise in free speech was perceived by many Muslims as an intolerable violation of religious respect. This incident starkly illustrated how deeply held values can collide. Religious devotion on one side, freedom of expression on the other, and how avoiding enmity in such cases can threaten the very fabric of open societies. It is precisely in such moments that people search for frameworks to explain global conflict. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations provides one such paradigm, casting many of these tensions as evidence of Islam's confrontation with the West. But is that really what we're witnessing? Consider the record. Are ethnic or cultural conflicts truly more frequent now than 20 or 30 years ago? Not exactly. Many bloody conflicts in the 1990s had roots in Cold War or even colonial legacies, like Rwanda, Burundi, and the Balkans, which remind us that deep political and social grievances, not just civilizational divides, exploded once authoritarian systems collapsed. In places like Yugoslavia, internecine war followed the breakdown of state control, much as it had after the collapse of earlier European empires. So when Huntington frames Islam and the West as locked-in perennial conflict, he overlooks these deeper currents. For one, he ignores the diversity within the Muslim world itself. Millions of Muslims are democratic, pluralistic, and forward-looking. Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim-majority democracy, is more often a U.S. partner than adversary. The same can be said of countries like Jordan or Morocco, which maintain strong ties with the West. Even geopolitics complicates Huntington's neat binaries. Saudi Arabia, often identified with conservative Islam, has long been one of America's closest allies. Its political and economic weight, particularly oil, has historically overridden ideological divides. The paradox of this US-Saudi partnership complicates any straightforward notion of a civilizational clash. But recent events underscore this complexity. Take the Gaza war of 2023 to the present day, which has reignited global debates about Islam, the West, and justice. But what looks like a clash of faiths is also a struggle over territory, national identity, and great power involvement, from US mediation to Iran's support of militant groups. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's return to power in 2021 and their continued rule reflect not a monolithic clash of Islam versus the West, but the failure of Western state building, regional power games, and internal Afghan dynamics. And in Europe, ongoing migration debates, whether over Syrian refugees in Germany, Afghan asylum seekers in the UK, or North African migration across the Mediterranean, often get framed in Huntingtonian terms. Yet many analysts argue these debates are driven more by economics, security fears, and domestic politics than by any pure civilizational incompatibility. And critics sharpen these points. Joseph Nye reminds us that influence today flows not only from military might, but from soft power, like culture, diplomacy, education, and technology. The West's relationship with the Muslim world includes tensions, yes, but also millions of daily connections through universities, trade, and media. John Mearsheimer, the realist, would argue U.S. confrontation with Islamic states has little to do with civilizations and everything to do with resources and balance of power logic, like oil in Iraq, counterterrorism in Afghanistan, security guarantees to allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. Lastly, Amartya Sen critiques Huntington's flattening of identities, reminding us that Muslims are not only Muslims, they are also Indonesians, Nigerians, Britons, Americans, feminists, engineers, soccer players. Defending them by religion alone sets up the very divide Huntington describes. And what about terrorism and radical non-state actors? Groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS thrive on exactly this civilizational framing, casting themselves as defenders of Islam against the West. Yet the roots of their power were shaped as much by failed governance, economic despair, and foreign intervention as by ideology. The so-called clash often serves as a recruitment tool for extremists rather than an objective description of reality. Indeed, if Huntington were right in absolute terms, conflict between the US and Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation, would be inevitable. Instead, Washington and Jakarta cooperate on trade, security, and education, despite major differences on issues like wages or LGBTQ rights. This forces us to confront an unsettling possibility, that the clash of civilizations narrative may itself be a political instrument. Leaders and pundits use it to justify wars, surveillance, and cultural fears. The clash becomes not an unavoidable destiny, but a story, one that can be weaponized to shape policies and public opinions. So, is the clash real, or is it a lens used to control how we think about conflict? That's the question we have to carry forward. Nonetheless, however, as we probe deeper, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The West has historically supported radical Islamist currents when it served its geopolitical interests. Both Washington and London once saw militant Islam as a buffer against secular nationalism during the Cold War, arming the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s to bleed the Soviet Union, or backing Gulf monarchies to counter Jamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt. This history complicates any simple narrative of a civilizational clash. The US may preach liberal values, but time and again it has allied with regimes that suppress them. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Kuwait, because strategic interests outweighed ideological consistency. This paradox was exposed again during the Arab Spring of the early 2010s. The West cautiously supported uprisings in some countries, but defended its old allies in others. Liberal rhetoric collided with hard realpolitik, undermining the idea that democracy promotion drives foreign policy. Looking to the future, some analysts suggest that we're moving toward parallel blocs rather than an open clash, a world of partial coexistence, where civilians live side by side while protecting their own spheres of influence. In the Western Hemisphere, the US still dominates, but Latin America increasingly seeks autonomy through organizations like CELAC, CELAC, formed in 2010 to foster regional cooperation. Meanwhile, countries like Brazil and Argentina have started leaning into expanded BRICS partnerships with China and Russia, signaling that Latin America won't always align neatly with Washington. Across the Atlantic, the growth of Islam is undeniable. With nearly 2 billion adherents worldwide and demographic momentum on its side, Islam is projected by Pew Research to become equal in size to Christianity by the mid-21st century. From Casablanca to Jakarta, its presence is vast and fast-growing, accelerated by migration, higher birth rates, and diaspora communities globally. In cities like London, Paris, and New York, Islam is part of the cultural fabric, complicating Huntington's neat divisions. That raises a provocative question. Are we heading toward convergence, not clash? Some speak loosely of Chrislam, pointing to theological overlaps between Christianity and Islam. Reverence for prophets, emphasis on charity, ties to Abrahamic tradition. Realistically, deep doctrinal divides remain. The Trinity versus strict monotheism, salvation theology, and differing gender norms. A true synthesis seems unlikely, but what is realistic is a growing recognition of shared values like justice, community, and care for the poor. Values that might support coexistence if cultivated wisely. Still, the future could swing either way. Will convergence unfold peacefully or through violent friction? Consider Iran. Its backing of armed groups from Hezbollah to militias in Iraq and Syria fuels ongoing confrontation with both the US and Israel. The Gaza war, currently happening, has only deepened these rifts, with Iran's influence across the axis of resistance more visible than ever. Or look at Turkey under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, often branded a neo-Ottoman for his ambitions to restore Turkish influence. Erdogan has backed military operations in Syria, brokered maritime deals with Libya, and expanded Ankara's naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean. His policies secure energy routes and project Turkish power deep into Africa. Just last year, Turkey signed new defense deals with Libya while upgrading economic ties with the Gulf states. A blend of rhetoric invoking Ottoman legacy and cold strategic leverage. For neighbors like Greece and Egypt, this fuels fears of destabilization. For Europe, it raises the specter of new clashes along the Mediterranean's civilizational seam. Here again, the clash of civilizations narrative offers one explanation: Erdogan reviving Islamic identity in opposition of Europe's Christian heritage. But realists like John Mearsheimer would say this is less about Islam and Christianity and more about Ankara asserting itself as a rising middle power. Meanwhile, Joseph Nye would note that Turkey also wields soft power, television dramas, cultural diplomacy, and trade routes to win influence without war. The lesson is this: Huntington's categories capture some fault lines, but they flatten the complexity of geopolitics. Religion, culture, economics, power politics. They're woven together. Whether the future looks like blocs in coexistence, selective convergence, or repeated conflict, will depend not just on civilizations in the abstract, but on leaders, alliances, and the choices societies make. But also, when then do the Eurasian giants like China and Russia fit into this changing landscape? Some argue that the United States is in decline, while China and Russia are on the rise. But the truth is more nuanced. The US faces domestic turmoil, political gridlock, and increasing debt, yet it remains a superpower with unmatched global reach. Its military alliances through NATO, partnerships in Asia, and enduring economic dominance continue to anchor the global order. China, meanwhile, has rapidly moved into spaces once dominated by Washington. In Iraq, Beijing has become a major investor, funneling billions into energy and infrastructure, while also supplying arms. Beyond Iraq, China stunned the world in 2023 when it successfully mediated a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two bitter rivals who reopened embassies after years of hostility. That deal was more than diplomacy. It symbolized Beijing's growing capacity to act where Washington could not, and marked a milestone in the shift toward multipolarity. Russia, though weakened by sanctions and its ongoing war in Ukraine, remains a disruptive force. Moscow continues to cultivate influence in Africa, where private military companies like the Wagner Group left their imprint. And it leverages energy exports to retain leverage in Europe and Asia. Together, China and Russia offer alternatives to US leadership through platforms such as the expanded BRICS bloc, which now includes countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these shifts. China and Russia not only managed their domestic responses, but exported medical supplies, vaccines, and support, generating goodwill in parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. These gestures increased their global visibility at a time when Western democracies were consumed by internal crises. In parallel, the US has often retreated. The Trump administration reduced troop levels in Iraq, signaling fatigue with forever wars. More recently, debates over US global commitments persist, shaped by domestic polarization and fiscal strain. Political gridlock in Congress has repeatedly pushed the government into the brink of shutdown, damaging Washington's reputation for reliability. In an interconnected economy, these domestic dramas reverberate worldwide. So looking to 2025 and beyond, economic realities remain central. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, US GDP growth is projected to slow to 1.4% in the rest of 2025, down from 2.4% in 2024, while global GDP is expected to average 2.6% growth over the next 5 years. Interest rate cuts may support households, but high debt levels and partisan budget fights risks undermining stability. Meanwhile, US competition with China across trade, AI, energy supply chains, and military posture in the Indo-Pacific will remain the defining rivalry of this era. All of this leads us back to Huntington. He foresaw civilizations clashing along cultural lines. But what we see today is something more complex. Yes, identity and religion matters, but so do power politics, energy resources, soft power, and technological competition. As critics like John Mearsheimer remind us, states pursue security through power, while Joseph Nye emphasizes networks, culture, and alliances. The world of 2025 looks less like a single civilizational clash and more like a multipolar contest. Messy, overlapping, uncertain. So in this first part, we've unpacked Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory, explored its historical context, and measured it against the messy realities of our interconnected world. But this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for part 2 of Diplomacy and Discourse. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and put a comment down below. Let's keep unraveling this tapestry of power, culture, and politics together.